So it is 7:03, and I'll call the meeting to order. We do have one real official thing we have to do is to approve the minutes of October 7th, or 2nd, I apologize. So I'm making the assumption that you've all had a chance to read them. Does anybody have any corrections or changes that they'd like to see? So I guess we need a motion to approve the minutes. No, we don't. I'll make, by consensus, we'll approve the minutes of October 2nd. And we'll turn the time over to you, Lucy.
Okay. So I think most, if not all of you know that there was this desire to do some team building, getting longtime members, not old members, longtime members and newer members wanted to sort of have an opportunity to talk, get to know each other, share some of their experiences, talk about some of the processes, and just be more prepared for things that are coming, which is great because we have permits coming to you on December 4th and 18th. And maybe at the end of the meeting, I'll tell you about what those are. Mel and Richard had provided some ideas to me. I assume that was from some of the discussions with you guys. And so it's meant to be casual. We'll go through the various, I think, 6 topics that are on the agenda. Actually, why don't I just, because I'm going to make the agenda disappear here in a second when I go to a PowerPoint, so we'll just share that. And, I don't have much to present. I just have I also have some of the slides that we used at the May meeting when we did the training, because I think having an opportunity to talk a little more, where it's a little less full agenda, may be a good opportunity to, grow our understanding of how things work. And I am using new technology. Okay. I think the first order of business was introductions. I put some suggestions, and they are absolutely suggestions. I won't ask you any more questions if you don't answer them all. Some of the icebreakers we use at work. Just tell us something about yourself is the last one, and I'll just go first since I had an opportunity to think about this and you haven't. So Lucy Sloman. I have never lived in the city. That is some of us, various planners have different preferences. My preference is not to live in the city where I work because just going into PCC in the morning, I run into plenty of people who like to tell me their thoughts. That's right. I've had friendly encounters such as that one. I've had unfriendly encounters as well. I have been a liaison to DC just for a few years. I have been working with the city for like almost 24 years, but I've only been an employee for about 8. For a long time, there was the Major Development Review Team that specialized in the urban villages, and it was almost all consultants, and so I was a consulting planner to the MDRT. And then when they incorporated the MDRT and created the Development Services Department, Keith Niven had been promoted to Economic Development Director, and I was made Land Development Manager.
Had you worked for a city before? Or?
So as a consultant, it's kind of interesting because I'd almost always done long-range planning. I'd done like 9 comp plans in as many years, and I thought I never want to see another comp plan if I can help it. Mm-hmm. I really was more interested in kind of urban design and current planning, and so we had provided staff services to a lot of cities, so I traveled, Blaine, Camas, Marysville, Mount Vernon, East Wenatchee, all kinds of cities through, mostly in Western Washington, and got to know them, worked with their planning department. It was just around the time that growth management was starting, and before growth management, you know, there were a lot of planning directors who might never do a comp plan in their entire career. And so, especially at small towns, they didn't have the bandwidth. There might be 2 or 3 people in the department. And so they would hire us and we would work really closely with them. I had to read the local newspaper, which was great. You know, I hadn't lived in Washington that long, and so I learned a lot about Washington through doing that. It was really nice.
Yeah.
And I've just always liked being in small towns.
What were some of those small towns you did contract with?
The ones that I mentioned, like Marysville, Mount Vernon, Camas, Blaine, from one border to the other. But in Marysville, they actually went through 4 planning directors in a year or so, and so I was the constant. So anyway.
Where did you study planning?
So I have, my undergraduate degree was an independent study in architecture at Connecticut College. I grew up in Dallas. My parents wanted to get me out of Texas. And then, I know, well, they took me kind of, they both grew up in other parts of the country, so they really they believed in that. They just assumed I'd come home to Texas. And then I wanted to just study architecture for grad school, and so I I applied in the Northeast and out here, and I just thought, I'll never afford to live anywhere I want to in Boston or New York or Philadelphia. They're such expensive cities. So at the time, Seattle was not the most expensive city in the United States. So I moved here in 1980. So I've been here a really long time.
To go to grad school then?
To go to UW, and I got my master's in architecture.
Excellent.
And then, but my poor parents, my last year in grad school, I went to study on the UW's Architecture in Rome program. And I realized I wasn't really interested in buildings. I was really interested in cities. So I did my thesis. Kevin knows exactly what I'm talking about. I did my thesis on the UW's campus in downtown Seattle. And so I just sort of used my thesis as a way to read and study all the things that I would have done if I was doing a planning degree. So, and I mean, given what we do and how architecturally oriented we are in the city, it's been really useful to have an architecture degree.
Yeah.
Lucy, during your time in high school, I'm curious if planning is something you've always thought about prior to college, or that just happened and you transitioned into it?
Boy, you guys are getting the full story here. So I thought I was going to be an archaeologist. And then I went and there's a sort of testing thing called Johnson O'Connor. There's one here. And when I did it, they said I was too extroverted to be an archaeologist, that someone would walk by and I'd look up and break it, So I went off to college thinking I was going to be a physics major. And, but double integration blew up my brain, and I just said, I don't think so. And then I did art, and then I landed on architecture, which was sort of a nice marrying of the two. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm, yeah, I think I've shared enough.
Well, I'll just follow the form to start, and then we'll see where it goes. Name is Ben Rush. I've lived in Issaquah since 2007, which would be 12 years now. Been on the DC for, I don't even know, a year? Somewhere there. Previous to that, I was on the UVDC, which was the evolution of the MDRT. Am I right about that, kind of?
You were the commission that served with the projects from the MDRT, you're right.
Got it. And that was, I think I was only there about a year and a half before that ended up dissolving and kind of rolling into this. I also live in the Issaquah Highlands, so I got started with volunteering by being talked into working with the Architectural Review Committee. Eventually, because we didn't have anybody else to do it, they put me as the chair. I ended up turning that over just a couple of months ago after 9 years.
Wow.
And in the meantime, I'm also on the board of directors for the Highlands. In fact, I just left there a half hour ago. So I've got a few things that I do, but what I'd really like to, this has been a good beneficial thing for me is you start from something very small like architecture review where you're looking at a front door color up to something very large like an entire city and how it operates and everything in between. It's pretty interesting for me. I mean, between the architectural aspect to a neighborhood, to the finances of a neighborhood, to how a city is planned and how it works. And there is some commonality, but there also is a lot that is different between them, and you do pick up quite a bit. So I find it interesting. I guess that's how I got started in volunteering with it. Hobbies, I have 3 young children and 2 dogs, so I don't have any hobbies other than chase them around and make sure they are okay. So, but that's really why I'm here.
Ben, I ran into you at Zeke's Pizza not too long ago. Is that your favorite pizza location in Issaquah?
Yeah, it's close to my house. So it's an easy one to walk down to, and works as an office sometimes when the kids get too loud. So
you work out at home?
I do, yeah. I work out of my house, and that's worked out pretty well. I looked at, originally when I moved to the area, I moved from Portland, Oregon, and I looked in, originally went to Bellevue and rented an apartment and kind of thinking, okay, it's central, this is easy to get where I need to go. And then started looking north and south, and then 405 north and south was and still is kind of tough in the morning and the evening for commutes. And so this made a lot of sense to me for some reason. Big open highway that went straight out and never seemed to have too much traffic. And while it's increased over the years, it's still more manageable than other areas that I go to that are just difficult to get in and out of. So, yeah.
So Ben, I'd ask that you tell them what you do, because I think a lot of them would be interested, other commissioners would be interested.
What are you poking at?
So I'm a manufacturer's rep in the construction industry. So I actually work with, probably 80% of what I work with is mechanical engineers. So it's working with them on behalf of manufacturers that I work with and educating them on product. They know a lot more about the whole picture than I do, but I tend to have a very specific look at what I'm talking about, and it works out well for the two of us. So a lot of it is computer and screen time, but a lot of it also is face-to-face and going and seeing people and working through projects. And it's kind of the same thing. I get really small projects, and I get really big ones downtown that, are much more complex. So.
Hello, my name is Arthur Schulte. I volunteered on the Development Commission since beginning of 2019. So moved to Issaquah last summer from Redmond. I've been in the greater Seattle area for about 22 years. Really enjoying it. I joined the board, really to be involved in the community and try to help shape the direction we're headed. Everything from transportation to utilizing my expertise in architecture and knowledge to help shape the cities and help get us moving on a good path and continue keeping us moving on a good path. And obviously we're seeing a lot of growth in the greater Seattle area, and all of that is expanding towards the east side. And with the introduction of the light rail in the future, that's going to play a big role in how that shapes Issaquah, as well as Sammamish and the surrounding areas. By day, I'm a project manager at MG2, architecture firm downtown, right near the Ferris wheel. And then by night, I'm an adjunct professor at Lake Washington Institute of Technology. So I teach architecture there. So that's Tuesday and Thursday evenings for me.
So this is your Wednesday?
This is my Wednesday.
It
That's
used
right.
to be his Wednesday.
It used to be.
You
That's
rearranged
right.
the schedule just
That's
to be
right.
able to do it.
I'm committed. I want to be here with you guys, so I talk administration into changing my schedule around. So far, it's working out well. So we work on all sorts of different projects. MG2 actually is doing the Costco headquarters in Issaquah. So I joined shortly after, that's been kind of going through design review, so I haven't had really barely any involvement on the project, but it's been exciting to see that evolve over the years. So right now I do a lot of mixed-use development, multifamily. We've got several high-rise projects we're working on in Seattle. But education is an important part of my life, and so inspiring the next generation of architects and students, I enjoy that. So, you know, translating and sharing what I learn in the office with my students, that brings a lot of fulfillment to me. And you know, I can see myself doing that for a long time. And let's see here. Hobbies include various water sports, paddleboarding on Lake Sammamish, biking, walking, running. I'd like to get into kite surfing eventually, and you know, utilize wind power to get moving on the water. Hiking as well. Let's see. First job, I actually worked at the Chevrolet dealership here in Issaquah. So that was my first job. I worked in their service department. After that, I started selling pond equipment. So I was a pond sales guy. So I would pressure my customers to buy pumps and plants and fish, and of course with good intentions, but. And I transitioned into architecture. I've been in the architecture for about 8 years in the industry, and I'm excited to see where the future takes me. Lately I've been getting interested in real estate development, and but I definitely can see myself staying on the commission for a while. I really enjoy, you know, so far working with you guys and learning from you guys, and picking up the ins and outs, and so I appreciate the opportunity.
Do you work closely with Ted?
Yes, on some projects, but he manages a lot of the high-rise projects. I'm mostly focused on the mixed-use, kind of the mid-rise projects, with the occasional help on the high-rise projects. But he sits right across from me,
Okay.
so
Did I
we
ever tell
interact.
you he was my next door neighbor?
No.
Yeah, I
Okay.
moved into a house in Maple Leaf and moved in next to Ted. I think he was happy when I
Oh,
left.
okay.
I would always pester him,
Yeah.
ask him about his projects and stuff. So.
Well, that's one of the things I appreciate about the industry in general, and the planning and the architecture. It is a small world, so it's amazing who you run into from time to time. So.
And when you say mid-rise, you mean like the 5/2
Yeah,
type of stuff? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
Are you
wood
guys
frames.
looking at any of the, is it CLT?
The cross-laminated timber.
Yeah.
You know, we are. There's a couple of projects coming across our desk that we're looking at potentially going after. We're still building that expertise in the office right now, so we're looking at some conventions that we want to attend and get a little bit more involved with that. So I definitely see more integration of that in the future projects.
So we have our first building that we're reviewing. It's a Raleigh office building, and it kind of blew up everyone's brain when it came in for all the reasons you're saying. It's, you know, trying to figure out, you know, how do you review it, how do you inspect it? You know, a lot of it isn't in the code in the same way that
Right.
other materials are. So we're pretty excited.
Is there a 30-second view of what that is?
Well, cross-laminated timber is essentially a timber framing product that, you know, when you look at the imagery for a lot of these projects, you see this very open concept look and feel. It's a different look altogether aesthetically. You know, you'll look at projects that are kind of open, have like an open industrial look to them, where you see the exposed steels and exposed ducting. So if you envision that and replace that, you know, with your a wood look essentially, that's kind of what you see. Maybe if you look at some of the cladding here, and imagine that on ceilings, beams, different shades, and you get that kind of look. And
There's one advantage is that you can go taller, right?
yes,
Because I
that's
remember when
correct.
we were doing the Central Issaquah plan, there was that question of once you got over a certain height, like 5/2, you had to really jump up to 10 to 12 stories before it became feasible, because you had to go to steel or concrete, and you had to get that much taller. So I wonder if it can help fit in with some of those 7, 8-story buildings that might not have worked or something with.
No, you're absolutely correct. One of the benefits of CLT is being able to go higher without really seeing or requiring new addition of structure, such as a conversion to steel and metal studs. With these mid-rise projects, when you reach a certain height, they become classified as high-rise projects. So there's a whole lot of other criteria that come into play with that, including smoke prevention and as well as metal framing too, once you reach that certain height. So again, we're seeing CLT really starting to kick off. I think some of the big questions I've heard in the past is regarding the production of CLT and whether there's enough factories or manufacturing facilities able to keep up with demand. If that really kicks off, and what happens if one of those factories or manufacturing facilities goes bankrupt or doesn't do well? How does that affect the industry? So I think we'll see more locations popping up and more growth in that. But
Yeah, and I'm curious about the long-term use of it for the reasons you describe in terms of, maintenance, I guess. I do a lot of remodeling. So how do you remodel a building like that? And do the technologies exist? And what technologies will come out of that to alter those structures?
It's a great question. I don't have all those answers. It's interesting. We had a lunch and learn actually a few weeks ago where a representative came in and talked a little bit more about CLT, and that's exactly one of the questions I asked him is, in terms of longevity of the project and the flexibility to do rehab, what does that mean? What can we see? And there's planning that has to be done ahead. I mean, it's if there's damage to any of the interior pieces, that has to be patched up. It's not simply as replacing a drywall, right? So. And obviously covering everything in drywall doesn't make sense because it just defeats the purpose and the look that you're going after. So there's still unanswered questions with that. Good question, yeah.
Hi, my name is Kevin Price. My name is Kevin Price. I've been in Issaquah for 5 years now. But early when my wife and I started dating, we would go on all of our dates in the city of Issaquah. And we knew at one point we would move here. And so we were really excited to actually just do it one day. We lived in Seattle for over 20 years, which was great. We saw that city, the face of that city change tremendously, but we just wanted something different. And so we bought an A-frame here. And we've been sort of rehabbing that, which has been an adventure in and of itself. So I've been on the DC now for, I guess, 3 years, coming up on 3 years, or a little more than 3 years. And I was on the design review board in the city of Seattle for 3 years as well. When I left Seattle, I knew I wanted to continue that in some fashion. So this seemed like a great opportunity. So I applied, and then I waited and I waited and I waited. And then I didn't know if I didn't hear anything. So I'm like, well, I guess I didn't get on. And then I'm reading some memorandum one day, and I saw the list of people that were accepted. I'm like, oh my God, I got on. So I was really excited to continue sort of that work I had started in Seattle, in some fashion. And it's different what we do here versus what they do there. I feel like this has a lot more impact in terms of the variety, I think, and I'm really proud of what the city's done to develop the current guidelines, and participating in that process has been really, really tremendous. So it's been a lot more meaningful for me, and so it's been an exciting experience in that regard. Something about me, beyond that, hobby, I'm an architect, so that means my hobby is architecture. When I'm not working at work, I'm doing side work. I also serve as a design review member for Suncadia Tumble Creek. And that's actually a paid position. But, which is a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. And you get to see a tremendous variety. You get to see a lot of interesting approaches to mountain architecture. And what you're seeing up there these days is a lot of modern architecture. You know, it was founded on this idea of traditional mountain homes, but the marketplace and the type of people that are in the region, typically high-tech, want more modern structures. So it's interesting watching the face of Suncadia change as well, which is kind of fun. That's about it. My first job, I was a junior ranger, and I still maintain that was my best job. I made trails for the city of Boulder. That was a lot of fun. Worst job was that as well. Because, you're 16 and you're just like, what am I doing? But that's really it in a nutshell. Other than that, I think everybody knows I'm an architect. I do custom residential design, so it's much different than the face of what you do. I worked with individual clients to design their homes, and it's everything from new homes, primarily remodels, but some new homes as well. So that's it.
Where'd you go to school?
Colorado, University of Colorado at Boulder. Yeah, so I grew up in Boulder, and then I went to college about a block away, which meant I had to leave. So I came here.
Not far from home.
Yeah.
Or Boulder described as 20 square miles surrounded by reality.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly
You can
right.
get shipped off to Connecticut.
I know. Yeah, Boulder is, I refer to it as Disneyland. And you got to get out. It's a wonderful place to be, but it's not reality at all. Yeah.
Kevin, at any point did you, think about buying a piece of land and building something from the ground up yourself?
Yeah.
Versus
but
rehab?
I'm an architect. So.
Isn't that every architect's dream?
They weren't going to lend me the money to do that. No, I appreciate that. Yes, of course, that's the dream. But and it's still the dream. Still may happen.
Okay.
So we'll
Great.
see. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Brooke Shore. I've lived in the city for a little over 4 years. I've been on the Development Commission since April. I applied for the Development Commission. I actually applied for several commissions. The Development Commission was the only one that chose me.
We're the smartest commission.
And I just felt compelled to give back somehow, and so I thought that would be a good start. Hobbies, well, I guess for job, I'm a civil engineer. For the first 7 or 8 years of my career, I did design, and then the last 10 years I've worked for a general contractor, so doing construction, estimating, project management, scheduling, and I build transportation type projects, so roads, bridges. My company's doing the I-90 job out there that you guys
Oh, that
probably
expansion?
drive through all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. And first job, McDonald's, also worst job.
What is that project on I-90? I'm not clear on. Is it a drainage infrastructure?
They're doing drainage right now, but the main purpose of the project is to add an auxiliary lane between 900 and Eastgate. And then there are noise walls for
Is it-
several
is it-
miles.
Is it all the way to 900, not just to Lakemont?
Yes, on eastbound.
Wow, that'll be great.
Yeah.
The sound walls are not continuous.
Yeah, they're,
We WashDOT worked with us a lot
Yeah.
on that, and there were a lot of questions.
About where they chose, which segments got them and which segments didn't.
yeah, there's several miles of noise wall. I can't remember how many, but there's a lot of noise wall.
So how long is it going to take them to finish the project? Next
I think it's summer of 2021.
But I will tell you that Westlake Sammamish, between the state park and Lakemont, will be closed for
Yeah, they're
several
built,
months.
there's a wall there on the road. Yeah.
We got them to agree not to do it during the holiday season.
Wow.
Brooke, are you referring to on I-90 itself, the stretch between Issaquah and Bellevue, that whole
Yeah, right
stretch,
now
what
the
they're doing,
road is
expanding the lanes?
shifted and there's
okay.
barrier.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you see the light rail going through that center piece of land? It seems like an ideal spot, but I
Not
was curious.
recently, no.
Okay. All right.
I thought maybe that's what it was for.
No, no, it's just extra traffic lanes. So when cars get onto the freeway, they don't have to merge. They could just stay straight for a while, and that's supposed to help ease traffic because they won't be weaving.
Perfect. I like it.
So, hi, Mike Brennan. I have been on the commission for over 10 years, I think. I lost track, but a long time. I am one of the at-large members, so I don't live in the city. I live in a city just to the north of here, just across the border. Have lived in the same house for about 24 years now. So lots of, participation in everything that Issaquah has to offer. There's a place to live and recreate and buy stuff and everything else. Really enjoyed working on the commission. My regular day job is in development services. I work for a city just to the west of here. Have been there for a long time as well. So this is kind of bringing some of what I've learned both in school and in my career to help here. Got encouraged to kind of toss my name in by the guy to my left here, and said, "Sounds interesting," and I got the call too. So it has been interesting to the evolution of this commission in my tenure, and you can probably hear even more from Mel here, who's been on longer than I have. That it really has changed, not only I think matured as a commission, but the way that the city regulations and the city staff engage with the commission has changed. And I think in a lot of really good ways. Issaquah is really emerging, as a place where people really want to be, and it's attracting lots of development. And now we've got things kind of sorted out with regard to the Central Issaquah plan. I think that will start to really take hold. And I think well positioned. I think the city is to have that kind of smart growth, but relying on this commission and others to help guide that, and that's an important role. So I think that's something that I take seriously, and I think it's been beneficial to the projects that have come through here, and we hear that back from the applicants too, that they appreciate. I know it's an extra hurdle they got to get over, but they appreciate the suggestions and sometimes requirements that come from the commission that really affect their projects, and I think in a lot of good ways. So I think the commission really provides a valuable service to the community, and it requires significant commitment on our part to be ready to do that. But I think that my observation is the commission has always got great talent, and people are committed, and that's what really makes the difference, I think. What about me a little bit? So things I like to do, I like outdoor stuff, so a lot of hiking, and I like to ski and bike and whatever else is going on. It's a great place to live for that, so I try to spend as much time as I can out doing outdoor things. My first job, I guess, I grew up in Wenatchee, other side of the mountains, and my first job was working in a fruit warehouse, cold storage in the summertime. So it's 100 degrees outside, and it's like, 35 degrees where you're working. So you're wearing a coat and long pants and long underwear, stacking boxes full of cherries on pallets, and then they take it away and you stack another one. It was great fun. Worst job. So that's that. Then I decided maybe that's not the kind of career I wanted. So it wasn't obviously needed to go off to college. So I did. I went off to Washington State University, and I got my Go Cougs. I got my undergrad degree in construction management. So.
Where'd you go to graduate school again?
And then I, mid-career, went off to graduate school at the University of Washington.
Go Dogs.
And you made me say that in a public forum on the record now. So
Thank you.
I'm conflicted, not really. Let's go Cougs. Especially during the Apple Cup, so which is coming up. Let's see, what else? I think I've got, my wife and I have 2 daughters, both grown and out. One recently engaged to be married, so getting ready for that and checking the bottom line of the bank account, going, oh, it's going to do some damage. So but looking forward to that.
How many at-large members, or how does that work?
2. We have 2 at-large members on the commission that are not required to be residents of the city. The code speaks to that.
Thank you. I just completely drew a blank. I don't know whether I don't remember if there's a specific number or it just cannot be the majority.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm Mel Morgan, and like Mike, I've never lived in the city. We lived in the same house on the plateau for 26 years. It was an Issaquah address at the time, but it was King County. It was before incorporation up there, so I kind of thought I lived in Issaquah, but didn't really. Year or so after we moved in, I thought, well, I've got to do something to give back to the community. My background is in commercial real estate appraisal. I saw the Development Commission, the description. I thought, well, I kind of understand real estate. Maybe that's a way I can help out, and applied. And I think this is my 25th year on the commission. So I'm still waiting. Do we get paid, or I wasn't never cleared on that?
I
So
brought cake.
The Suncadia Commission, that's an interesting concept. They get
yeah, that's right. I do remember we had a meeting, a joint meeting with like Redmond and it was Redmond and Kirkland Planning Development like commissions once up at the San Michelle. No, it was at the Red Hook Brewery. And I remember somebody from there mentioned that they got paid some hourly rate for when they had commission meetings, and then we never had those meetings again.
I'd say smart move.
That's right.
I was smart enough to, driving here was always tough, and I wanted to get a ride, so I convinced Mike to join the commission, so I could get because he and his family moved in next door to us, and the great thing is they had a baby shortly after they moved in, and it was nice enough to name her Morgan. So I thought that was, yeah, most neighbors should do that. So anyway, no, it's been great. It's been really wonderful. And one of our hobbies, I think, is probably discussing urban planning stuff. Really bore our wives.
But nothing that's in front of the commission,
Nothing in front of the commission, generally, yeah.
just to make sure.
Quick to clarify.
Yeah, exactly. First job in high school, I was a DJ on the radio. I grew up in Shelton, which is a little lumber town down by Olympia, and I had a neighbor that worked at the local radio station. It was a country music station, and he was leaving to go off to college or something. He said, you should apply. So I had a weekend job. I'd go in there in the morning and get the news off the AP press and stuff, and just sort of run the station the whole day. So. And so that was interesting. I'm not sure about worst job, but maybe my best job was being a bartender at Dante's Tavern in the U District. So
I live very near Dante's.
Did you go in there?
Which has been closed down for bad behavior.
Oh no! So you went to school there in 1980?
Yes.
Yes. Did you go in there then?
Yeah.
Any of the dollar pitcher nights on Thursday?
Oh, I didn't go into Dante's. No, I lived very close to campus, and so I was, I'd go to the, what is it?
The College Inn pub,
College Inn, thank you. I
Yeah,
kept saying
yeah.
university in my head. No, College Inn was kind of my stomping grounds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So were the Jell-O shots your idea?
Well, fortunately, it was just beer and wine for us. So, yeah, at the time at least. So, and now I work for a company, our company invests money for union pension funds. So we manage about $6.5 billion worth of assets. We own property, mostly West Coast, but into Colorado. We own an office project in Boulder and on the East Coast as well. And we own the Maple Street office building, which I'm the asset manager for. And it was interesting because when I was on the commission, we approved the project before I even knew about the company I'm at now. So it's interesting now running the building that we had approved before. So, and I think it always is interesting giving me the perspective from a property owner. And we're not developers, but we work with developers, so I understand sort of from the investment aspect of real estate and the things that are done and can and can't be done, or what that view might be. So, yeah.
So do you primarily invest in real estate, or are there other?
So we're probably 85% commercial real estate, and the rest is stock and bonds.
Okay.
So, yeah, and most of the pension funds we invest for would be like the local operating engineers union and the carpenters union. And so one of the things they like is that we always use union labor. So if we build a building, it's with union labor. So it's making money for them and it's putting them back to work. And the thing is with, people doing that kind of work, if you're a carpenter or plumber, you really need a pension plan because you can't do that into your 70s or 80s. So, yeah.
Nice.
So how many people went to the University of Washington? I'm just curious if you pay
Come
any
on.
attention to football and happen to notice what the University of Utah did to them a couple of weeks ago. I just
I'm a Ute.
so am I.
Trash
Really?
talk time.
You're a
I
Ute?
watched last year's game.
Did we already know that?
Well, last year's last year.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Pac-12 championship? Oh, I'm sorry.
that's all right. So I'm Richard Soa. Honestly, I was trying to think of how long I retired from the U.S. Forest Service. I worked for them for 40 years. I started off in Ogden on the Wasatch. It's Wasatch Cache Forest now, and worked my way through college and all kinds of interesting things. Moved 17 times. As a federal employee to advance, you generally have to move. And so I wanted to advance, and I did, and I ended up as the National Director of Engineering for the Forest Service. Retired 9 years ago. Lived here. I retired in January. We came here on a house hunting trip in September, and I bought a house in Klahani. And so once again, I thought I was an Issaquah person, but now I'm a Sammamish person. So, but at any rate, I really like I did have several years that I worked for the Federal Highway Administration and changing into a different federal agency. And but the frustrating thing about that was that it was all engineers. And I don't know if you have any preconceptions about what an engineer might be, but usually we lack a little bit of personality. So I've been kind of impressed with Brooke because she can laugh and smile and be polite.
You're the exception, Richard.
No, I'm really not. But so at any rate, decided to go back to the Forest Service, and what I found really compelling was being able to mix technical skill with resource objectives, and we went through the NEPA phase and interdisciplinary teams and realized that we had a responsibility to build roads. The Forest Service, people don't know, has 350,000 miles of road, and so I spent the first half of my career building lots of miles of road, and the last half of my career unbuilding lots of miles of road because the American public made some changes on what their expectation was off national forest. But I really like the notion of interdisciplinary team decision-making, and one of the things that was most frustrating is that we got so involved in interdisciplinary team making that team decisions that we kind of forgot that at some point somebody had to make a decision. So it was really that was one of the kind of hints that maybe it was time for me to move on. So I retired. I retired back in DC on January 3rd. We flew here on January 4th and moved into our house. I'd been working at a fairly high level, and so I was working 15 or 16 hours a day. contrary to what people think of government employees, and I really loved it. I'd been in DC twice. I had to convince my wife is a real good negotiator, and so to convince her to move back the second time, she made me promise that she got two trips back to the West Coast, because we have kids, one kid in Redmond and one kid in Tukwila, grandkids in Redmond, and then she said I could only do it for 3 years, because in the federal scheme, that if you work at the same rate for 3 years, that's what dictates your retirement. So if I hadn't made that commitment, I'd have probably stayed there for a lot longer. But regardless, we moved here, and when you go from 16 hours a day to, the worst thing is you move from the East Coast to the West and you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and there's nothing open except a Denny's in Issaquah, which is gone now, but that saved my life, because I got every day I'd get up and go down and eat breakfast and read the whole paper, and, got to know the waitress and there were a couple that really well. So, but I needed something to do, and I really like the notion of planning and resource management, so I volunteered or applied to the River and Stream Board and the Development Commission, and I was accepted for both. And the River and Stream Board met a few times. The Development Commission didn't meet for a year, and similar to whoever's experience, I figured, well, I didn't get picked. And the same thing, they sent out an agenda, and my name was on the agenda, as part of it. I said, well, all right. So Randy Harrison was the chairman, and I didn't know what to do, so I came in and I sat over there, and they held the meeting, and after the meeting, I walked up and I said, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, and he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I think I'm on the commission. Yeah, that was really fun. So, at any rate.
The engineer's approach to it.
Engineer's approach. I have to say, I really, really like the Forest Service. I really like my job. One of probably the best job I ever had was working for them for 40 years. And I think my first job was my best friend. We were living in Ogden, Utah, and my best friend talked me into going and picking beans. And wow. So we got this great idea that, it's hot. It's like 500 degrees outside and no wind, and you're in these bean rows. And we're going along, and all of a sudden this bean whizzed by my head. I kind of looked around, and it turned out that there were 3 or 4 young laborers that were not too happy that we were there taking their job, and so we got in this great big bean war, tore down about 50 rows of beans, and they asked us not to come back. So that was probably my worst job, first job and worst job. My hobbies: I like to fish. I volunteer at the Issaquah Salmon Hatchery just about every day. I like to do woodworking, and I've got 3 grandkids that are all old. Like, I think the youngest one's 22, and I have 3 great grandkids, 2 and 1.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
That's pretty good. Well, thank you.
What a variety of talent. You think about the mix we have now on the commission, from engineers, technical, experienced architects, finance folks. It's great. Yeah.
2 youths.
And 2 youths. Yeah, that's new.
I think we're going to hear about that a lot.
I'm from here,
so.
but I went to school in Utah.
Oh, I see, okay. Yeah, it doesn't ever.
That doesn't happen very often.
Well, so I'll start through the agenda. Feel free to turn it back to something more entertaining. So one of the questions, which was really interesting because I didn't know exactly how to answer it, was how the commission fit into the city organizational structure. So Lucy's crazy diagram. Like the federal government, there are 3 branches, the legislative, judicial, and administration, and we all sort of fall under the administration. I put us on an equal level, because we're both decision makers and recommenders. Depends on the permits. We'll talk about that later. Sometimes DSD staff is recommending to you all for a decision. Sometimes we're recommending to you all for a recommendation that will then go to the council. Sometimes we're making recommendations directly to council. That's usually on code, not on permits. So I think that's sort of the basic structure. Any questions?
Any changes foreseen in the structure of the city development services department, anything like that, with the new city manager?
Yet to be determined. There's a study, I can't remember exactly the name of it, but there's something that I'm not sure he knows exactly what it was intended in the budget. City services study or something like that. So we're not sure what that is and whether that may result in some restructuring, but not anything we know about at this time. So these are the slides that I showed you earlier, but I want to sort of do it in a little more unpacked and informal way, since we were in with PPC and the attorney and everyone. So the main permits that come to you are the site development permits, a master site plan, and development agreements. So we're going to talk about that, some about the review process, and then some of your other responsibilities. For site development permits, there are actually 3 triggers now, depending on what part of the city you're in. It could be based on the site size, it could be based on the street that you abut, or it could be within central Issaquah, the building size. And on those permits, you're decision makers. With master site plans, those are sites greater than 15 acres. And in that case, you're making a recommendation to council. What typically happens is we actually bring a site development permit and a master site plan to you at the same time. And because they're coming to you at the same time, the council ends up being the decision maker. The idea with master site plans is to have a master site plan that could be built out in phases. I think that staff is beginning to think, as part of our Title 18 update, that we don't need master site plans anymore, because really master site plans were the tool we had before we had development agreements. And so we are thinking that rather than make every project go through the master site plan process, if you have a school and it's all going to be built in one phase, does the master site plan provide you anything that you wouldn't get through the site development permit? I think we're thinking no. But that will certainly be one of the conversations that we'll want to have. And then development agreements, and there's no particular trigger for those. They typically, for an urban village, that would be more than 15 acres. So that you can see where there's the parallel to the master site plan. But a development agreement is just, to be an urban village, you have to be 15 acres. You don't have to be 15 acres to be a development agreement. That's just the tool the city chooses to use. And it's really up to the council to decide that, to say, yes, we want to proceed with staff investing time and commissions and the council investing time.
Are there any new development agreement areas that you think would be like areas big enough that are undeveloped that?
We're seeing some small development agreements. Take Gilman Lofts, what you saw. I mean, it came through during the moratorium, and they used a development agreement to agree on the terms, and it was mostly about transportation funding sharing. So the development agreement was capturing that funding partnership. So, that's an example of where it's a very small site, but the development agreement was the tool to allow that to proceed and under what terms. So I don't think we'll see big I think given some of the ending of development agreements and the challenges we've faced, I don't know that we would want to enter into any more
Yeah.
development agreements. But, you know, there could very well be a property owner that comes forward and the council sees an opportunity for both public benefit and working with that property owner to create a vision and a kind of commitment to each other, and might happen.
Okay. Unrelated question maybe, you mentioned the Gilman Lofts. I'm curious, would we ever be able to do like a field trip to something like that was a unique project that we went through, to actually, when it's done, to go out there and on a nice day and talk about, okay, here were the plans, here's what we saw, here's what we initially saw, here's what we came up with, here's what it looks like now, here's how it functions.
Yeah, I think, Mel, that's a great idea. We did that this summer with Rivers and Streams, who was interested in going out and see some of the mitigation plans that they'd reviewed and how it had played out and whether it was what they expected. Actually, 3 or 4 years ago, we started doing it with staff as well. Every August, we take all the projects that have been finished in the year and we decide which ones we want to go see, and we just spend a whole day going and walking projects. We try and have some of the inspectors along. We have planners and engineers, because we just really want, you can look at the drawings, you can look at the pictures. It's not the same as standing someplace and saying, would we ever do this again? How did this work out? Are we happy with this? Why didn't this work? Why, what would we want to do differently? And I think those are great conversations. I think I would like to wait till next summer.
Yeah, when the weather's nice.
But I think that's a great idea. And so think about some of the projects you'd like to go visit. I mean,
Okay.
I know Gilman Lofts has been offering staff to come out and see it while it's under construction. I haven't taken advantage of it because I don't need another boot. But I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, great.
Are there any development agreements in place that are set to expire?
No, not that I think of. There was, in 2018, we terminated 3, Issaquah Highlands and Talus. There was a little one where the YWCA and Z-Home are. That actually was a separate development agreement. And then the, what's artfully called the WashDOT TDR development agreement, which is where Pinecrest and Sunridge and Bellevue College, all of the residential portion, because that was complete, was pulled out. And so the development agreement continues to exist, but just for Bellevue College. And I don't remember the exact term, but there's probably a fair amount of time left on that. That was just available for the college because there was no telling how long that would take. Then the next set of development agreements was Rowley Properties. The next year was Lakeside for the upper portion, and then Swedish was pulled out of Issaquah Highlands and made its own development agreement because they knew Issaquah Highlands development agreement was going to terminate soon. They bought another 10 acres and 700,000 square feet. I think they have a total, I think they have a total of just over 1 million square feet, of which they built about half. And that actually, they're required to do a master plan in a certain period of time, and that's going to come up. So in the next, I would guess maybe a year or two, the master site plan for that may be coming to you all. But those are all like 20 and 30-year development agreements, so I think they'll be around for a while.
Did you guys look at, did the commission look at whatever's going on kind of over by the trampoline sales place?
I think that's part of the Rowley
Yeah, is there going to be a
development
brewery?
agreement.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Mel has been talking about that brewery.
Yeah, Formula
I heard a
Brewing.
rumor.
It was very competitive which staff person got to review. That seemed like way too much fun.
And then you have the Costco campus. expansion and development.
Right, thank you for mentioning that. That one is unusual because, again, it was partly or primarily a transportation financing partnership for building 62nd connection and the bridge and everything. But as part of having that agreement, and there are actually a few small transportation improvements left to build, for Costco to make that investment in transportation improvements, they wanted some certainty about being able to expand and build out their campus. And so the garage is permitted and under construction, and the office building is pretty close to having the permits issued. Yeah.
Will they start construction on the office, you think, once they get the permit?
Oh, yeah.
Jump right in?
They would like to have had the permits ages ago.
Yeah, okay.
Some of it is just, there's been some technology issues related, there's a lot of pile driving and stone columns, and so we're learning a lot about new technologies on the valley floor. And then part of it is just, that's a really big, complicated building for both MG2 and the city to figure out how to pull it all together. So another question was sort of what, lay out the process and sort of help the commission understand where you fit into it. We typically start with a sort of what we call a collab meeting, and that's where they may bring in just a sketch or a very loose plan, and it's an opportunity to sort of make sure they're looking at the right codes, talk about what we know, what they want to do, and kind of make sure we're all pointed in the same direction. And then we encourage them to come in for what we call a pre-app meeting, where they develop more detailed plans. And the idea is to try and really work together, reviewing, so that when they bring in their full SDP, there's not a lot of changes, that we can go straight into writing a staff report and getting it on to you guys, or the administrative site development permit if it's a smaller project. And we do a staff report, development commission, notice of decision. For some reason, we have 3 appeals right now. I have to tell you, I have done no appeals in my entire 24 years here, and I'm doing a lot of appeals right now.
You're not the only one.
Yeah.
Only one suffering from that trend right now.
Yeah.
It's just part of the growth pressures in the region. I think
Yeah.
we're seeing more pushback.
What is the appeal process?
So there is a certain period of time. So when we issue, when the Development Commission, I'm just going to play it out through the process that you know. Let's say one night that you vote to approve something or to deny something. And you usually authorize the chairman to work with the staff to prepare a notice of decision. Staff may or may not have started writing it, but a lot of times there's things that happened that last night that we need to make sure are reflected in the notice of decision. We prepare it, we send it to the chair, who reviews it, signs it, gets it back to us. We send that out to all the parties of record, including the applicant, and there's, I believe, a 14-day appeal period in which they can submit an appeal and pay a fee. And then we use a hearing examiner, which is kind of like a judge. And that is a firm that we contract with. And it's very court-like, which is kind of, although I've learned more than I care to about that process. It's pre-hearing orders, motions, briefs, staff reports, and then we go make a presentation, and the hearing examiner issues a decision. And then that is typically the end of the road within the city process. There is the ability to appeal to Superior Court.
So the appeals are only by the applicant?
No, frankly, this isn't the way we ever operate, but we could appeal one of your decisions, you could appeal one of, like if one of you didn't agree with the decision, the applicant could appeal, or a third party. I mean, the Evergreen Ford appeal is a third party. So in the urban villages, the development agreements, typically you had to demonstrate standing. I think that may have been one of the motions for the Issaquah Environmental Council, was whether they had standing to appeal. I have really not read any, it's not my problem, so I just kind of follow along at a distance.
Generally, it's a party of record, somebody who has engaged in the process along the way has standing to appeal.
So does somebody have to have some actual basis for the appeal, or they just file a form and say, I don't like this decision, I think you should overturn it?
They could. It would be an unwise use of their money. Yes, you need to, if you want to be successful, you need to find that there was an error. And, I think that is one of the things that's sometimes hard for citizens to understand. When, as I remember a project at Tallis that a lot of neighbors were unhappy about. And as I said to them, when you're a neighbor and you're commenting on the original permit, you can just say, I want all the buildings to be blue, I don't want any traffic. You can say all the things that you want to say. And we have to consider those things and whether there's a basis in code for adding conditions or mitigating or constraining the project based on those comments. But going forward with the appeal, you need to demonstrate that there's some kind of error that's been made.
Before it would go to a hearing examiner?
Well, most hearing examiners would just go ahead and hear it. They may, for instance, if a citizen says, they could submit an appeal and the appellant's motion, the applicant's motion could be, this should be dismissed. And the hearing examiner could choose to act on that motion, or they could say, I want to hear the whole thing before I make a decision.
Okay.
Is there a cost for the group or person appealing?
Yes, it's $750, which is a lot for an individual, and there's a lot of times they will have lawyers or other people to assist them. It is one of the few areas in which we're not covering the city's costs. They can be quite expensive. We're paying for the hearing examiner's time, we're paying for staff time, and often staff consultants. If there's, with Evergreen Ford, a lot of that's going to turn on the experts that we had coming and testifying. So then, whether there's an appeal or not, and assuming that the appeal doesn't overturn, we then go into construction permits. Often they will submit them. They can submit a permit at any time, and it's partly because sometimes people want to get vested to certain codes. But we recommend that they not submit until after the first meeting with you so that they have a sense of whether there are any big issues because we don't want to be doing all the quality control review of their permits to find all the ways it doesn't comply with the conditions. But we cannot issue, of course, any permits until after that decision and appeal period. Then they move into construction. We often do a series of permits, like a site work permit will be infrastructure and grading, building permit, landscape permit, and it allows us to not have to review everything all at once and kind of begin to get things out in a series. Then there are, of course, inspections and then occupancy. Some of you who've been on a long time, we are not done with Gateway yet. We're just getting ready to try and get occupancy. That's the project on Newport. It's called Anthology now. 19 buildings. They had
So
separate.
there's nobody moved in yet?
Oh, no, they're all moved in. You can get a temporary certificate of occupancy
Oh,
if it
okay.
meets all the building code requirements, and it's considered, health and safety and basic functionality's been taken care of. Often we're doing landscape inspections, sort of infrastructure inspections. If the, if you can drive and walk safely there, we may be saying you have to fix that crack or add that bench over here that you had on your plans. I think the 2 5-story buildings right along I-90 are not occupied yet, but the rest of the site, I was there inspecting this summer and they were all swimming in the pool, and I'm just thinking, this is weird. But I think that is one of the things that's just remarkable to me. We started in 2016 or something, doing the land use permits for that. And, it's, or maybe even 2015, and here we are, at the end of 2019, trying to close out the project.
I'm curious, Lucy, for projects, I think it's the Taco Bell there on Gilman, that's kind of on hold. Do you see a lot of pressure on your end or on staff end to, get that moving, maybe by the general public, or I'm not too familiar with the history of that or what's happened there specifically, but I've always been curious as I've walked past and ridden past, what was going on there.
It says opening soon.
Is it? Oh,
I thought that
okay.
was just me that noticed that. I'm like, is it taking long?
We have
Yeah, I
gotten a
was just-
few calls.
Yeah.
I think one of the, so,
Was
one
that an
of the
inspection
things,
issue?
I will say one of the things that's interesting in the city of Issaquah is that a lot of the valley floor is a floodplain. And people sometimes make choices in the floodplain and don't understand the implications of it. And the regulations for stormwater, for architectural review, for floodplains, they've all just gotten more and more complicated. And I think, sometimes it's a national organization that isn't used to working in this part of the state. Sometimes it's a single-family homeowner who sort of gets carried away and doesn't realize that they are in a floodplain. And so it's, we just have to stop and figure out how we move forward.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So the main focus for you guys is the area that has the box around it. We get the permit, we prepare a staff report and bring it to you. So I'm going to sort of unpack that bit of the process a little more. Did you have a question? Okay. So taking those 3 boxes, staff report, development commission, and then the notice of decision, generally we issue the staff report about a week before. Our first goal is to get it out to you electronically. Sometimes it's a day or so before they get it in the mail. But there's been a push to try and make it all electronic, but I don't think most people have big enough monitors to be able to read the drawings at home. And so I continue to push that you guys get paper copies of at least things with drawings in them. It's a public hearing with these permits, and the 2-meeting format is an outgrowth of sort of something we developed under the MDRT, and our goal is that at that first meeting, we hear the comments and concerns and questions from the public and from the commission, and then be able to go away and work with the applicant and sort of figure out, do we add, edit, revise conditions? I've done one meeting, occasionally have done one meeting, and it's really tough negotiating in real time with commissioners and applicants, and The other thing I like about it is it creates a really good record for staff and applicant later on, that if things that have come up, we have both, Susan Lowe, as you know, because you review them, takes the most amazing minutes. And, I may still have to go back and look at videotape, but I can read through the minutes and kind of have a pretty good idea of where the thing I'm looking for is. And then with the briefing response memo, it really creates a pretty detailed explanation of why we're recommending what we're recommending. And then coming back to you to sort of get your final take on that additional information. And then, as I said, we go away after that, if you've authorized us to prepare a notice of decision. The notice of decision, as Richard can probably tell you, and anyone else who's been a chair, it's pretty long, it's pretty boring.
It's really exciting.
Yeah. We have to do findings and conclusions. We usually put the motion in because often you're editing it, editing the conditions through the motion, and we think it's helpful to have that in the notice of decision as well as all the conditions to provide any guidance, especially if there's an appeal.
How often does the chairperson change? Are you elected or volunteer or how?
Annually, I think.
Yep. So typically, the meeting or so after the new commissioners are seated, then we would hold elections. We usually like to give the commission a heads up that at the next meeting there will be elections, so people can think about it and get their campaign slogans together.
Or skip, try to avoid.
And a lot of times we've had like a vice chair become a chair kind of thing, and then partly I think with keeping Richard around too was because of the project that we had up in the Highlands to keep that continuity of those meetings going and everything, so.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm always, sorry, just,
No, that's okay.
I'm always impressed with the staff report. It's incredibly comprehensive. Can you tell us a little bit about what goes into that and seeing behind that curtain? Is that just one planner writing all that, or is that a variety of people preparing that document?
It's mostly one planner. I think we're an unusual department because Keith and I both came from the MDRT, and part of the reason that I think they merged, so when DSD was created, it was planning, building, current engineering, MDRT were all merged together. And I think the idea was to sort of benefit from some of the lessons. I think we've also seen some of the shortcomings of that entity. But I think the thing that meant a lot to both of us was that the planners and engineers worked hand in hand. And the idea was to build a great community and not just to engineer a perfect system. And so one of my engineers calls us plangineers, and I really like that. So I think it's been kind of unusual for a lot of planners to come, when they come to the city, or even the planners that we had when there was just a planning department. I expect the engineers to write the engineering sections, the roads, the circulation sections. One of them will take the first shot, and then the other one follows along. But, because of the nature of the staff report, probably 75% of it is written by the planner.
Wow, yeah. It's an incredible document sometimes.
Well, and it's thank you. But I think part of it is sometimes some staff have wanted to really streamline that process, and I think that we're a very detail-oriented community. It captures, I think what we've tried to do is strike a balance where we capture a lot of detail. I can't tell you the number of times where I've used the staff report to say to the applicant, see, I told you this was going to be an X, and it's got to be an X. That's the way we described it in here. Yeah. Or 5 years later, they want to change something or add something or expand it, and we've got something to go back to and say, how did we think about that? Why did we make that decision? Why is it this way? And so, I think the interesting thing about staff reports is they serve a number of purposes. And, if you ever look at one of our administrative staff reports, it's so much more streamlined because it's really just between us and the applicant. But when we have these bigger, more complex permits that we have to explain to the public, to the commission, to the applicant, it is more unpacked.
One of the other things I really appreciate is the city map that calls out all the various projects that are going on, and you're able to click anywhere specifically and receive all that documentation specific to that area, to that zone. So it, again, congratulations on that, and I think that's great.
I have had nothing to do with it, but I completely agree. We use it, I send, I actually finally went to communications and said, we need a URL just for that map. And they finally put a banner on the front page because we were sending so many people there. And, the school district uses it, the county uses it, the assessor uses it, the school, both transportation and planning at the school district use it. I mean, it really, we have an amazing IT guy who's embedded in our department, and we are so lucky to have him because, don't be looking at him.
No stealing.
No stealing. He's stolen some of my staff, so I have cause.
Ulterior motive.
No, it was a good thing.
It's all fair.
It is. But he's just really good at tailoring everything and troubleshooting, and he and Christopher Wright, who is your liaison for many years, really came up with that as a tool to communicate with the public because, it's just really hard. The new website's going to launch soon, and I think they're actually going to tie that map to neighborhoods because for a lot of people, they want to understand it from a neighborhood, not a whole city perspective.
So I agree, the quality of the work, I mean, the staff in Issaquah are top shelf. I can tell from experience working with them. So the other thing too, little by little, you've modified the process and the products, and we're still working through kind of implementation of the Central Issaquah design guidelines and how that all works. But the thing that you did add, this response memo following kind of what was previously called the community conference, provides another level of documentation, I think, that serves what you just described after permit issuance. But it also helps us because there's these breaks that we go through, and when you come back, it's really well organized. It says, you said this, here's how the applicant and how the city are responding to the comments from the commission, and the public too that speak. So I think that's a great tool for, one, keep creating a good record, but it's also really helpful, I think, in keeping the process kind of clear and on point as we go through toward making the final decision on permits. So I really got to give a lot of credit to the city's continued evolution and refining the process that we use, and still obviously work in progress, always is.
Yeah.
But it has gotten really well organized, I think. So.
Well, thank you. And the thing I would say is some of our best ideas comes from you guys. So don't hesitate to tell us, if you, for instance, our development agreements, the reason we have consolidated definitions was a commissioner just said, why do you have a set of definitions in every single appendix? That's insane. And we're like, yeah, it is. But, you just sometimes, you guys see it from a different perspective, your users, and we really appreciate those suggestions about what is helpful to you, because a lot of times it means it's so much clearer, and it makes it sometimes it even makes it much easier for us to do what we do. So don't hesitate.
And the nice thing is, because before, like when we would have a community conference and then a project come before us, and there'd be times where a bunch of points were brought up in a community conference, and then there'd be the project, but nothing mentioned, and thinking, well, did they just ignore my comments, or nobody paid attention, or didn't like it, or what? And it seems like in your responses, you catch everything, and I like how you group it together at times to say, here this group of comments about this. And so everything's in there, so even if something wasn't changed, we know it was addressed and there's a reason for it, or here's why it was addressed differently than we thought it might be. And that's really helpful to know.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, and I know sometimes you guys say, no, not really, it hasn't quite been addressed yet. But, that in and of itself allows us to really focus. And I think that's the important thing too, is, I know you guys are trying to track all the various threads that come up from the public, from your fellow commissioners and yourselves, and being able to go through and say, yeah, that one was addressed for me, this one's addressed for me. I still have questions or concerns around this one, I think really lets us then, we have these bases for just sort of saying that one's done, and this is the one where we're going to spend our time. You guys just went through this other responsibilities, which is the preliminary plat community conference. I think that was an outgrowth of, in the urban villages, plats were handled totally differently than in the rest of the city. In the rest of the city, both the preliminary and final plat goes to the hearing examiner. And I think that, I don't know what you guys are doing, but final plats will probably move to be just an administrative decision. The state has allowed that. And putting together the stuff for a final plat in front of the hearing examiner is so time consuming, and really it's a technical review of compliance. And so I think we feel that while, you spend all this time on the technical stuff, and then you have to write a staff report saying, what did I do with all this technical stuff? But in the urban villages, we would go to the commission, and then we would go to the council, and the council made the decision. So it would take forever, first of all, just because you had to get an agenda bill, and then you would go to a committee, and then you come back to the full council. But I think one of the things that we appreciated is that as much as these activities are absolutely legal activities that have to be done in compliance with the law, we're also building community. And there are often things with some subjectivity in terms of a performance standard or a design guideline that we're looking for input on in terms of whether we are complying. Those are the things we really like to have a conversation with you, because, if there's supposed to be 15 parking stalls and there's 15 parking stalls, there may not be a lot to talk about. But is it pedestrian friendly? That's a great conversation. And so I think that was part of why we looked at having the community conference with the preliminary plats in the urban villages. And I think that'll be one thing that we'll discuss about whether we're going to do that citywide. As part of Title 18, we're trying to take away all the 18 different variations on the things that we're doing. So that's, and having gone through that once, I don't know if you have thoughts about it. I would certainly be interested in hearing the commission's thoughts.
I'm trying to recall the experience.
Well, it was Shelter's plat.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that experience was something else. But I think, administratively, it's always the balance between how much process are you going to put in front of moving development through your system versus trying to make sure you're, from an economic development and city and community building standpoint, trying to create predictability and a fairly smooth path to let the appropriate development happen. That's what you're looking for. And so when it comes to the plat process, I don't know that we have a ton of added value. It is a very technical conversation or exercise when you're talking about platting a piece of property. It's really when you start, developing the projects that are going to sit on top is where I think the value added comes back in from the commission. I do think there would be, depending on where you want to take the process, there may be situations where the staff is looking for some feedback. It's not a decision from the commission, but it's a body that can provide some, it's a standing body that we can provide some consult back to the staff, even though it may be an ultimately administrative decision, depending on where it ends up. The idea of sending plats through a hearing examiner to the city council for decision, that would be very unusual compared to what's going on, I think, other places. I think the reason some of the laws changed over time was just because there was so much process in the way, and I think that the developers and builders were successful in trying to move some of that out of the way. But again, it's always this balancing act between how much process and regulation you're going to put in the way versus trying to smooth the path to let development happen.
And for a long time, we did a lot of plats. I mean, I don't even know how many plats I've done now. But I would say probably 80 or 90% of them are single-family plats. And, that's one thing. And then plats for non-residential or multifamily projects are another. And so I'm just not sure that we have enough big pieces of land that it's going to be a really key issue anyway. But just, it's good to hear your thoughts.
I think part of the difficulty with the community conference for shelter was we'd spent a year listening to all the stuff and really didn't learn anything new. And so, at least in my case, I didn't think I learned very much new. And so the consequence of being able to have any effective input into it was pretty much taken away, because all that had been already discussed at length. And I think it might have been more profitable had we not had any insight into it, because we could have been a little more. We could have been a little more interested in and objective in what our thoughts were, and being able to take a real hard look at it. It just seemed like it was a duplication of what we'd been through for a long time.
Well, and I think one of the things that, we have only done community conferences for site development permits up till now. And so this was a new thing. And I think that one of the questions is, how do we highlight for the commission the policy issues? I mean, that's one of the things we do when we send agenda bills forward. So I used a community conference staff report for a site development permit, which in retrospect may not have been the best starting point, because there's so many more design decisions in a site development permit than there are in a plat. And so it may be more, looking for some of those performance standard questions and highlighting that to help the commission sort of focus on the part that isn't prescriptive and therefore, doesn't really have a lot of variation or consideration involved with it.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful. I was frankly confused by it. I'm like, and that's not a hard thing to do, but I didn't know what our role was or what I was doing. So I think highlighting some of that, just for at least my purposes would be nice. I just didn't know what I was supposed to do, so I felt a little stale in my delivery. But.
Yeah, there had been a lot of history, so I felt like I was missing a lot.
Kind of like the Downton Abbey movie. I don't know that all of these are changes, but just things for you to know. So first of all, the thing, I sent you the agenda bill. The UVDC, the Urban Village Development Commission's duties have been assigned to Development Commission and Planning Policy Commission. And so that just means more work for you. Title 18, I just want you to know, so Title 18, I'm sorry, I'm speaking in code. The Issaquah Municipal Code, Title 18 is the land use code. That's the ones that you are typically reviewing your projects against. So Title 18, we have a consultant, we are rewriting it. I think the main impetus is there's one section of Title 18 where Old Town, Central Issaquah, Issaquah Highlands, and Tallis are all stuffed in this one chapter. And then whatever's not in there for that part of town, you go to the next section, you go to the next. It's very unuser-friendly for both staff and applicants. So part of it is to pull all of this apart and put it together in a sort of proper form, and to make it easier for people to understand and find their way through. But there are some different things that we're doing along the way. So as one of the key users, I just want you to know that we consider you guys a stakeholder, and at some point we will be coming to you to talk about various pieces. There is also, there's a separate consultant for the sign code. There's another pair of consultants for critical areas after the Evergreen Ford fund. Council was interested in not just, a lot of things are just being carried forward and reformatted and just being brought into legal compliance with any state codes or changes. But what we've done is we've hired a geotechnical firm and a critical area, like a streams, wetlands, and aquifer consultant to actually come in and make sure we're using best available science, to make sure we're consistent with state code. We've also this year been updating the Shoreline Master Program. That effort is almost done, but all of these pieces are sort of, it's a big lift.
That's huge.
It's huge, and
like,
it's
wow.
mostly Keith and me, and I mean, we have consultants, but they pesky people have questions.
Yes. I mean, when you crack open any section of your land use code, just by itself, like just doing shorelines or critical areas, but cracking open multiple at a time that's a big undertaking.
Well, I mean, some sections are relatively new, like our wireless section, for instance. We're not really making any changes there. Other parts of the code have been around since 1996. I mean, it's just old.
Yeah.
And then there are the pieces that are newer, for say Central Issaquah. I think we're trying to figure out some of the pieces, how to make them more user-friendly. The urban design section of the design manual, I think we're thinking that may get more integrated into some of the, not to change any of the content, because I think we think it's the right tools, but pull it into the site design and things so that it's, the architecture is the last piece, but the urban design's a little further up front. We're still exploring that. The Park Strategic Plan was adopted last year. There's the green necklace, so there's code necessary to implement that. So that's a part of the Title 18 update as well. And one other thing I thought about with Kevin's comment is you will have another sort of design manual coming your way, which is as part of the Old Town area plan, or I'm not getting the name quite right, but the Old Town plan, there's an interest in architectural standards. And so there are right now standards, Old Town standards, but they're kind of outdated and they're difficult to use. It's a very specific palette of paints, for instance. Not necessarily that the colors are wrong, but just it's the way it's hard for staff to use. And we've hired a consultant. She's actually out of Colorado. Just from some of the initial stuff I've seen, I'm really excited by what she's doing. She's been doing a lot of evaluation of, because this is going to be standards maybe for single family. Because that was some of the concern, is how some of the neighborhoods are changing. So in addition to what we have for Front Street, there was a directive to do this for residential, but what does that mean? So now we're just starting to have those conversations with the community. I think in January we're going to do a walking tour, And so at some point, because those may very well be something that you're implementing, I would imagine. This
So those would be standards that would be applicable to the neighborhoods that adjoin the Old Town area or in the Old Town area, or is it citywide?
No.
Okay.
So that's for Old Town. I will say that we have almost no standards for single-family right now. And I'm not really interested in regulating architecture. I've been there. But I do think from an urban design and sort of site planning perspective, there may be some things that we want to look at. We did that with Issaquah Highlands and Tallis because we've been doing this for a long time. So we've put something out that was adopted as part of their replacement regulations. And since we're pulling that into the code, we have to consider, is that only going to be for Issaquah Highlands and Tallis, or might some of those apply to single family? So those are the kinds of conversations we're having and that will get rolled out, and I'm sure will result in lively conversations. So that's all I had to tell you.
You had the input on the DC review process kind of just for us. I thought what might be, since we've talked about how it's evolved over time and just from just the mechanics of the meeting, especially for kind of the new members, the one thing that it's a nuance, but it can be confusing, is when we're doing like the community conference, which is the introduction of the project to the commission, so we can get initial feedback at public hearing, so the public can provide input. So generally the way the chair handles it is, do you have questions? The first part of the conversation is about questions. And so we try to stay on asking questions to the staff or questions to the applicant or their team. And then the second part of that is after we've gone through the Q&A period, we go to comments. So then we give our individual feedback. So we kind of go down the line or wherever the chair decides he wants to start in this case and say, here's what I think about the project and things that I like about it, things that I think we need to do some additional work or exploration around. So then the staff has and the applicant have not only this dialogue of a back and forth to create better understanding of what they were trying to accomplish with their design, but then our direct feedback. And then if there are things that we want them to specifically produce to come back with, a different elevation of some sort or a different material type that we'd like to see, what would that do to a project, then we would ask for that and then they would bring that back. And that would be in the follow-up discussion. Try to be reasonable in what we're asking for, but enough to give us, because there have been some instances where the design, the level of detail wasn't at a point where we were really comfortable being able to make a decision, and some of the feedback was, you got to give us more. You got to give us a materials board and color palettes and more information about how the landscaping design is going to evolve and things like that. So just the mechanics of the meeting, I think that's been pretty useful, I think, in a successful way to just kind of get through it and then try to be more disciplined in how we give that feedback, so we're not scattered all over between questions and comments.
Yeah, because I think that's been one of the things that over the years we've had issues with as commissioners that would start in with comments and maybe ask a question of the applicant and get a response and then start to give feedback to that and say, well, here, I think this about that and so forth. And it's really more just get all those questions out of the way before we give those comments back.
So I'll just tell you, the UVDC just throws everything at us. We will handle it whatever way you want to deliver it to us. I mean, it is very handy that it's divided into those two sections, but it's not necessary for staff. We can figure it out. I think it's really what serves your purpose and helps you move through this process in a way that's meaningful to you. And it is handy to get it that way.
Yeah, and one question, I guess, in a community conference, in a regular, like a site development permit, applicant, public gets a chance to comment, and then we close the public comment. Community conference, would we always do the same? Would we essentially close public comment, or would we still, in essence, sort of leave it open because it's It's not quasi judicial and stuff, right? So,
I think that's the key point, Mel. When it's a public hearing, it has a much more structured and set of steps. I'm trying to, if I can get a quiet moment, I've gotten a lot of feedback from the clerks about, I think they've been learning a lot through the intensity of things that have been happening over the last year, with certain recommendations about how to sort of meet requirements better, scripts for various pieces. So I'm working on trying to get some of that put together. But I think that the point that you highlighted is a public hearing is a very formal, prescribed legal process. A public meeting, like a community conference, is not unlike the process we're doing tonight. It's only prescribed by what you choose to do. And so if you want it to be an ongoing dialogue through the whole meeting, if you set aside a portion of time and then you change your mind, there's nothing that requires that you have to open it and close it, or you can't take comment later on, or call someone back up because people are disagreeing about what that comment meant. It's a much more informal process.
okay. And we still have the ability, though, in, say, a site development permit, if we had a question of, say, somebody from the public, we'd close the public hearing, we're discussing it, we had a question about what so-and-so member of the public said, we could still
I think you can
bring them back in
reopen
to
the
the extent
public
that we
comment
want.
period.
Yeah.
And
Well, at least the chair could, I guess. And, yeah.
right, and there would be certain requirements in doing that.
Yeah, okay.
I think
Go ahead.
just on the community conference versus the public hearing. So the community conference, you're right, I think it is, and we've done it both ways, where we've actually had members of the public kind of weighing in at different points along the way, but we try to compartmentalize it a little bit, saying here's a period of time we want to hear from the community, but then there may be some follow-ups. I think we have to be careful. We don't want to, it really depends on the project and its projects. If you have a room full of people and it's pretty amped up, you could get into a really uncontrolled dialogue if you don't put parameters around it. So keeping it more rigid about this is the time for comments from the community, and then the commission would have its discussion is good. As soon as this is in front of us, it's quasi-judicial, whether it's community conference or not. It's an application that's in front of the commission. So we've got to follow the rules, I think.
You have to follow the rules, but because there can only be one public hearing,
So that would be
the community conference cannot be treated as a public
Right.
hearing, because then we couldn't do the later segment. But and you make a really good point. The nature of things is changing. I think as long as we're not looking like we're capricious from one permit to another, I think that the structure can vary to some extent. I think you can be as structured or as unstructured as you want to be, but I think Mike makes a really good point. You wouldn't want to be totally unstructured for one permit and then hardcore structure for the next one at the community, because someone might say, I'm being treated unfairly, and that might be a valid complaint, even though one had 50 angry citizens and one had one curious neighbor, which might be the reason that you do it, but you shouldn't vary too much, because it can look like you're showing favoritism or not treating people equally.
Yeah.
If I could have a clarification, apologies, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but the community conference is that first initial step that the Development Commission is involved in after the pre-app, and have I been part of a community conference or just the public hearing?
So this is the
meetings?
challenge of the city of Issaquah, with so many different codes in different parts of the city. Some parts of the city don't use community conferences. And so Central Issaquah doesn't, for instance. And so many of you have not had a community conference. And then there are other parts of town where it's typically a community conference super early, not long after the pre-app. And then you might not see the project again for a year or 2 years while they get all their stuff together and come back, and we write the staff report and bring it to you. So that's what we're working on right now, is trying to regularize that, so that for staff and applicants and commissioners, it's much more predictable what process it is, no matter what part of the city you're in.
So the community conference
And
is
before Central Issaquah, since we didn't deal with urban villages, essentially everything was a community conference and then a hearing.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you were at one.
Was I in one?
There's only been one.
The preliminary plat?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, up in the Highlands.
Yeah.
That was the community conference here
Yeah.
at this location. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think the other thing that that we struggle with, and I'm just riffing on something Mike said, is, and as many of you with the things that you deal with in your real life, we get applicants who come in at all different levels of detail. Part of the land use process is to try and get everyone pointed in the right direction and make sure that the basic kind of, broad framework of the project is correct. They have enough parking, the entrance is in a good location, they can get the utilities in and serve it, the building is placed in the right place. What we're trying not to do is basically have a building permit in front of you, because that's a huge investment with a great deal of uncertainty. And yet what we find is both there's a desire to know a lot about a project, which is completely understandable. You want to feel confident in what you're making a recommendation on. And the other piece of it is just technology. We see these crazy detailed stuff coming into us that's almost like a building permit. And that makes us a little fearful, because it means that they've invested this huge amount in design. If we want to move something 1 foot, they're going to say, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so we're always trying to strike that balance between getting you guys the level of detail so you have a good sense of what you're approving, that they feel like they've shown things to you, and yet that they aren't so locked down, so designed that we cannot have the kinds of thoughtful, interactive conversation about how we're meeting the regulations.
And so in that public comment, back to just the content and the format, because I was confused, are we allowed to or expected to shape and inform some of what they're doing? For instance, like, phrases like, be sure to pay attention to that buffer, or, just encouraging them to think about certain aspects of the design as we review it? Or is it just a question and answer period? Or can we make comments that
Well, I
we
think
would like to see?
That's a great question. Like the public, you can comment on kind of anything. I think you may not be able to condition it if there's not a code basis.
Right.
I think most applicants are interested in doing a project that the community will be happy to see. I tend not to rein in and draw a bright line with commissioners. I want you all engaged. I want you interested. I learn things from you that may make me say I need to add something to the code the next time we're opening it up. And I think it tells an applicant, if I'm choosing between X and Y and that buffer, let's say, why don't I do Y? That's what they wanted. That'll make people happy.
Right, and that's what I'm...
The other piece I would say, I'm interested in Ben's take on this, is, for a long time I worked in the urban villages, and we didn't get to look at specific plants. We don't look at colors, materials. We'd only look at elevations from really an urban design perspective. But Sarah Hoy, who is the executive director and has been for a number of years, she comes to all the UVDC meetings we used to have. And I kind of think that what she was hearing was informing kind of how the ARC then went back to look at it, because people would give feedback about it. Now, she doesn't have to make it blue because everyone says they want it blue, but at least she knew going into it that the feedback was this should be blue. And so, I don't think they're hard, super bright lines. I do think there are times when if commissioners get way over the line, I may say, I think that's beyond the scope of what you can do.
Okay, thank you.
I felt like I saw that, a lot with, Jeff, who was very vocal during UVDC and in just questioning. And I think the committee also falls.
Jeff Walker was the chairperson for a very long time.
And so, to answer your question, I do think, it may factor to some degree. It's a very complex community organization up there, and that actually falls under, there's, believe it or not, 4 different ARCs up there that deal with how things are built out and styled and all that kind of stuff. So I think community input, whether it's here, whether it's there, anywhere, does factor. It's what people want, but there also has to be this balance of, even if you dial it back down to, like I said, this very small thing of just architecturally reviewing a home color, it's keeping the balance between the greater good, if that makes sense. Like, okay, one person may want to do this, but is it going to cause 4 other people down the street to call up and yell and say this is ridiculous, and that doesn't make sense. So.
So also just wondering if commissioners have questions about how this all works, or even suggestions if you've been here for a while, how we can do it better. I think this would be a good forum, because we don't generally get to do this when we're sitting up there. So,
I've got one thing I want to put out there is that maybe somewhat for new commissioners, but I think for all of us, is a couple things. One is during the question period, if somebody's raising a question, I think it can help if other commissioners accept that they've got the same questions to be jumping in as well and stuff. But when we get sometimes in questions, but a lot of times in comments, I know I'm never afraid to talk, and I get afraid sometimes that I'll make a comment about something, and I like to hear other commissioners input on the same things sometimes, because I really appreciate all the commissioners we have and all the different viewpoints. There's a lot of times I'll come into a meeting, I've read something, I think this about it, and I'll bring it up, and then I'll hear other thoughts about it and think, oh, wait, I'm missing something there, or Lucy corrects something. And so I think it's really helpful if somebody does bring up a question or a specific comment to get everybody's input on it, whether it's just, yeah, I agree, or no, it's crazy, or here's a way I view it instead. And I never want to talk so much like I am right now, I guess, to feel like I'm precluding other people from voicing their opinions, because I think that's what's really valuable about our commission is all the different viewpoints we have.
Well, I also think that you see that dialogue move into other, it grows, right, into something. Something might start as one topic, and then it spawns into other things that end up refining whatever the original question was.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'll often just yield. If somebody covered what I had ruminating in my head, I'm like, well, they got it. It's out there. Let it just sort of play out. And I'll often not say anything for that reason. Not that you're taking up the air in the room. I'm not suggesting that. I mean, just anybody that will say it. And I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, well, is that useful? And so I often don't say it. So,
But it might be what they do at council, and you might think about your own version of this, is if a speaker comes up to the microphone and says, I want all the houses to be blue, and when they're done talking, they have people in the audience raise their hand if they concur. And the reason I mention that is, sometimes when we're working with applicants, it's hard for them to know, was that just Mel, or is that all the commission is in concurrence on that? Or, for instance, if half of you thought it should be red and half of you thought it should be blue, then we can go away and sort of say, okay, what are we going to do with this? And so I do think it might be useful as people make comments to then say, how many other commissioners were planning to share the same comment or something, so that we sort of have a sense of, is this one person's issue or is this the commission's issue?
I think another thing that's been helpful on that, because I totally get that, because are you just responding to one, or do we need to blend blue and red together and make a new color? I don't know. But whatever that is.
Purple.
Purple. Well, that's why I don't know it. It's a husky color. But in summary comments too, so if we follow the process that we're talking about at a community conference, you can reflect back on what other people have said and say, I agree with what Commissioner Morgan said about the roof configuration, and I think we need to do something that's more interesting and maybe has a steeper peak or something, whatever, making stuff up. But so you're kind of confirming so that the staff and the applicant know that it's the majority, or if there's a division on the commission, we have very different points of view, then they huddle afterwards, go, now what are we going to do? But they can sort that out, and then we can I think speak more as a single body instead of a bunch of individuals that they're trying to figure out what it means.
Yeah.
I think it's probably more, for me, the operating norm would be more consistent with if you agree, you don't need to say anything, but if you disagree, the point is that when somebody brings up a point, I'm kind of the same place where if I agree with it, I don't have any problem, I don't say anything. But I think I've seen on the board or the commission where when somebody said something and people didn't agree, they weren't hesitant at all to say, well, I don't agree with that. I think this, that, or the other. So I'm not sure what.
Well, I think both are important. As simple as saying, if Mel says, I think this should be steeper and more complex, Mike could say +1 to the Mel's roof comments. I mean, I think it could be brief, but just give that, because it is a challenge. We go away and, we have all these comments and we're trying to sort of figure out which are the key ones and are we just responding to one person or not. But I also think that the other piece that you're bringing up is really encouraging a robust conversation. And I think sometimes if you're the only person, if you feel like you're the only person who disagrees, you may not, Seattle nice. I'm obviously not shy about talking about things from other perspectives, but not everyone feels that way. And I think I just really want to encourage that, because I think you're a very respectful, professional organization. This isn't intended to be personal. I don't think you guys ever make it that, and I think it's important. I think all of you are really thoughtful reviewers, and you bring up a different viewpoint. As Mel said, you might walk in the door with one thing, and you sort of, if no one says who's thinking, well, I don't think it should be steeper. I think it's plenty steep. I think that's going to be too visible from off-site, or, whatever it is. That's a great conversation to have, because a lot of times those things are performance standards or a guideline, and therefore you're trying to, kind of massage it and make sure it's at the right spot.
Well, that's one thing too. I've talked a number of people into volunteering, even for small roles, and I think the common pushback I get is I'm not qualified, I don't have the experience, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know what I'm talking about. And that's the great part about a committee, is that even if I say something that maybe doesn't make a lot of sense, or maybe there's a piece of it that somebody can grab onto and say, well, I do know about that. I know how to rephrase that or whatever to bring it and make it more relevant to what we're talking about. So I think that aspect's really important.
Sometimes, I'm guilty of kind of holding back because I hear a variation of something too. And, at times there's subtle differences, right, between the different comments that commissioners may provide. So I completely agree. And I want to make sure personally that I speak up and obviously, show my my thoughts and express my thoughts and opinions about something. And it's a level of transparency, right? I mean, when you've got the public there and representatives from, who knows where, right? Observing, we got to educate not just the applicant, but those viewing, the presentation. So, yeah.
So do you concur?
Yes.
One thing I would add on sort of the converse, over the years, there, have been times when people vote against something. And of course, that's everyone's right to do it, but if you're going to do that, I need you to know that I'm going to be asking for you to identify why you're voting against something. Mm-hmm. I think one of the challenges is that I think some commissioners have viewed it as they don't like it, so they're voting against it. And while it's your vote and you get to use it, as you choose, for the record, we need to explain why someone's voting against it. And especially if it was to actually deny the permit. I mean, it's one thing if it's one person and it's still going to pass, but if the commission was going to deny a permit, then we would probably have to poll every single one of you and ask for the basis of why you're doing that. So I just, because that's why I always give you go through the due process, that it has to be substantive, that we have to be, as much as we're here to have you represent the community, we also are having to do this based on the adopted codes.
Yeah.
And so we would want to understand in what way you think that the project is not meeting the adopted codes.
And just a really small thing, but if we get to the point, if you vote against something you don't agree with and the commission passes it, and then we vote to prepare findings of fact, that vote should still be a yes vote regardless, in a way. We've had projects before, somebody voted no about the project and it passed, and then they voted no on preparing the findings of fact, and it's like, well, there's no basis for that. They didn't agree with you here, but you should still be voting to
Authorize the
that.
chairperson and staff to prepare that.
Exactly, yeah.
Because that document should represent their viewpoint as well.
Yeah,
I mean,
Yeah, right.
right, it's not changing your view on the project.
yeah, your vote will be shown, yeah.
Right.
It says,
Right.
complete the documentation is pretty much what that says.
Right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Just a question for Lucy. Anything that staff needs from us that we can do better to make this run more efficiently?
Gosh, not that I think of. I mean, I think you guys are great to work with. I mean, I don't see anyone coming in and opening their packet as they sit down. That's one of my favorites. And you guys come in prepared, you're engaged, you're paying attention, you really want the public to be heard. You ask a lot of questions to ensure the public stuff is responded to. That actually, that is an interesting point to bring up. When the public gets up and makes comments, you will notice that we don't get up and say anything. We are waiting to hear from you what you would like us to respond to. So even unless I feel like something is so egregious, I just cannot let it stand, I will not speak about anything unless you ask me to say, could you give us your viewpoint, or, someone, and you guys often do this, several people said X. Can you tell us, what staff's viewpoint is, or what unpack what the staff report said, or point us to that part?
Would you prefer that, so a bunch of people are signed up to talk about something and they've made comments, would you prefer us to do that then, or wait for all those comments to come out, close that, and then during our questions, then bring it up with you and say, this person mentioned that? Is that?
Right, I mean,
Better that way?
I think you should get all the public comment,
Yeah.
and then you can sort out what pieces are of concern or of interest or, either worth commenting on or where you want staff to reply. Now, you know that we're going to prepare a briefing response memo and we're going to pretty much respond to everything that's there. So if you're not feeling particularly moved by it that night, you can always wait.
But not when that person's up at the podium. You don't want us to
No.
say, oh, Lucy, what about this? Yeah.
Right.
Just let
No,
them
we would
talk.
want, we don't want a call and response.
Yeah, yeah.
You want dialogue.
No.
Yeah.
And that's hard for a lot of citizens. I mean, I know I've been at council meetings and even some commission meetings where they are certainly baffled. I mean, they're there, they're engaged, they're curious, and no one's answering their question.
Right, they're asking
Yeah.
questions and everybody's sitting there staring at them or taking a note, yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing too that helps, depending on what's going on with the public engagement, is there are things that they may not know. We know it. We've looked at the documents in detail, or we understand the process. And asking a question, even though we know the answer, but it's going to be informative to the public for them to hear an answer to a question about the project that helps them get it. So every now and again, and you see something like that, it's like, well, they're really curious about something, but we know that we have either no authority there or that's a decision that happens someplace else. So we just ask staff, how does the process work when we're talking about blah? And so then you get an opportunity now to
Right, and I have definitely seen you guys do that, where you know that there is either a particularly strong concern in an individual or in a group of people, and ask us to do it, not because you really need to know, but because you want the public to know. And we're certainly, I mean, we're here as much for the public as we are for you guys, so we're happy to do that.
I do have a question, and I'm curious to everyone's thoughts and insights. Regarding questions, for the applicant, what are your thoughts on asking the same question or questions, consecutive meetings? Sometimes I end up doing that because I see maybe there's new members in the public, or just to try to get some clarification on something that others might have missed, prior meeting. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's still a good practice? I mean, do we want to, keep in mind the time frame and be conscious of that? But
So you mean if we've had a public hearing, the first public hearing?
yeah, and we asked a
we've asked
question.
questions and so
yeah,
forth.
and then we ask maybe
Then
some
on
of
the
those
second
same
one,
questions, or
yeah.
maybe one of those same questions in the following meeting.
I guess my thought would be, it would be if we didn't think they had addressed it enough,
Okay.
which I think can happen certainly if I had asked a question and either I didn't think it was addressed adequately or not at all or something.
Okay. Makes
Well,
sense.
and I guess the thing I would add is that's kind of since we cover most of the stuff that's in the briefing response memo, hopefully we're addressing a lot of the questions that a new attendee would have had based on that. But, they sometimes come up with brand new stuff, or you guys see something new. But that's part of why we go through it, is it's an opportunity not only to make sure you understand the answers that we've provided, but the public does, because they may not have read it, or it may be their first time attending, and so they haven't even had an opportunity to see the document.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think that's a good approach, yeah. If it's clearly answered, then, yeah, I mean, if there's changes, then I think that validates the question again, right?
Yeah, and it seemed like, if I remember right, like with the Gilman Loft, sort of the roof treatment, so they made some changes, but then we were sort of questioning that again because it was
Yeah.
a whole different look and brought up new questions about it.
Okay.
Right. Well, and, we're also dealing with lots of new tools, and so we're all still trying to figure out, like taking Gilman Lofts, what's complex roof, and thank heavens we have lots of pictures, because I think we've been relying on that a lot. So, as you also, I've been talking to the consultant for Old Town a lot about the checklist and trying to build a lot of that in up front. The poor graphic designer who got the design manual and had to rebuild it for software reasons, but then build the checklist into it. I mean, we backed our way into that over and over again. That woman was the nicest person ever.
Very patient, I'm sure.
Exactly. So just two things I would add. One is, and I'm not sure this is true of any of you, but I just want to let you know that when you get the meeting invites, partly because we need to have a quorum, and we've had some real challenges, not with you guys, but with some of the other boards and commissions having quorums. So please RSVP. Kind of what we're not doing a lot of polling, but I'm trying to send the meeting invites out earlier. I know it doesn't always work with everyone's platforms, but if you email back, I can keep track of it, and it helps us make sure that we don't have people showing up for a meeting without a quorum. But it's also that if you're unable to attend and you don't respond, after 3 consecutive non-responses, you can be removed from the commission. We would like to not do that.
That's how you get off.
Just don't come.
And that's a simple reply to that email to you, and then with Gretchen CC'd on that. Is that
That's
correct?
great. Yeah, that's great.
Because I did notice some calendar invites, or I guess some calendar dates and invites with some of the meetings, and I was looking for like an accept button or something on the calendar itself, but it's just still a reply.
I think because of some of the challenges, end of the year is just always insane. I mean, everybody wants to be done before the holidays. And so when Gretchen took over from Dominique, she, I think, was just trying to get a sense of like, how do we have quorums? How many meetings are there? No sense of with you guys, sometimes we'll meet every single time, and then we may not meet for 3 or 4 months. So I think she was just sending a lot of those out, trying to have a sense of like if we have meetings coming up. She and I are sort of figuring out, we're trying to find a good balance between, because she has all the boards and commissions. Ours are the most difficult, so we have those big packets. She may poll at some point, especially for a special meeting, for something that isn't a regular meeting. She may poll just to make sure we'll have a quorum. But when we send out the meeting invites, if you can just respond, that is probably the easiest way for us to track that we have enough people.
Okay.
We do have meetings coming up December 4th and the 18th. 4th, speaking of some of our conversations tonight, Inniswood, we are bringing back to you. This is for a consultation. It is actually a staff decision on the changes to the elevations. It's not necessarily that there have been massive changes in terms of major big things, but there have been so many little ones that we just want to make sure that we have retained the flavor. I think we feel like it's in a good place, but before staff make a decision, we would like your input.
Okay.
So we've been working a lot with the applicant, and both about the kinds of changes, but how to describe it, and the kinds of materials that will help you sort of easily digest, because it took us a long time to figure out what changes had happened. And we thought, this is our job, and you guys aren't going to devote that much time to it. And then right now, we are scheduled December 18th to bring the Tallis Middle School to you. And this is under the Tallis replacement regulations. There are a lot of moving pieces, and we may not make the 18th, but right now we are running fast and furious to get there.
A question kind of in addition to that. In terms of protocol for commissioners who haven't attended a previous meeting like this, the December 4th one, so it sounds like a continuation. Since I'm not familiar with that, obviously I'll catch up on that and read up the material. But at what point during that public meeting should I, mention the fact that I haven't been involved previously, but have followed up and read up on the material, watched any of the videos. when does that happen? Do I just casually mention before my first comment, or?
Well, I think this is kind of a unique one. We've probably had two, and I can't remember both of them. I can remember one of them. I think, so I have a kind of, the way I explain it to applicants is, if I look at an elevation that's that big and I can see the differences, then I'm gonna want to consult with the Development Commission. Because I think, now, is it a consultation? Is it a decision? That's a separate matter. But I think as part of building a sense of trust and transparency, we don't want you to go out and, I mean, this is the sort of Atlas problem. I think a lot of commissioners were very surprised when they saw it in the field, and yet it pretty much looked like it did in the plans. And especially the blue. And so what we have really wanted to do is ensure that if there is a change that we think that you would see and think that isn't what I approved, then we want to come back and either have a decision or a consultation. In this particular circumstance, we believe that this is an administrative decision based on the criteria, which are kind of general, I will admit. But what we have decided is that we want to bump it up a level to a level 1, which has public notice, so the parties of record and neighbors within a certain distance will be notified, and we will send these materials out to you. We're asking for your input before we make a decision. So I think it's not quite as sensitive as you're describing it. You're going to see the approved SDP elevations and the new building permit elevations. We will describe those changes, and we're looking for your input. I mean, if we were starting over again, that would be something different. But what we're saying is, do you agree that these are either improvements or neutral? In some cases, it's because of building codes, and we may not love the change, but there's not anything we can do about it, but we want to have that conversation with you.
And yeah, I think it's a really good question, but yeah, I don't think you would have to really disclose anything.
Okay.
That much more
just-
succinct.
Yeah. But yeah, just to say, oh, I think that looks better or as good as, or, yeah.
So I don't need to mention, no, I haven't attended the past 2 meetings, but I've read up the material this past weekend, watched the video.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think you just have to think of it within the context of the site development permit as opposed to a new permit. But I don't think that, for instance, I don't think you have to go back and read all the previous staff reports and all of that. I know you've been very good about doing that, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Brooke, I think you had the original idea for a get-together like this. Any questions you still have out there, or comments, or?
No, I think this was really helpful.
Yeah. I have to say, one thing, I have served on the commission a while, and our new additions have really been excellent additions to the commission, and I think we are, I think we have an excellent commission right now in terms of the members and experience and abilities and everything. I think and I've been to some other meetings of other commissions, and I do think we operate pretty well, and I think we're in great shape, so.
They did get the document on the probationary period requirements and all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
I appreciate that, and again, thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to the continued learning from the senior members, and not old, but senior in terms of service.
They're tactful, too.
And the other thing, I think it's, I think Issaquah really is lucky that we have so many commissions and we have the ability for public input on things, and I think it's helped make Issaquah a better place, and very fortunate, so.
Well,
And have great staff.
I think the strength of the commission is the willingness of the folks to read the material before you come in and identify the things that you're concerned with, and not being afraid to speak up. And so that's invaluable. And So you've all done a good job, and I encourage that for sure. And Lucy, thank you for putting this together. It was timely, and I think we're better for it. So unless people have more comments or concerns, or you want to go till 10 o'clock to kind of carry a theme here, I would recommend that we adjourn the meeting.
Good with that.
And have another piece of cake before you leave.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I can't take those cookies home because I can't admit defeat, so.